those early days were really challenging. Sometimes when people write about that period, they don't realize that. They talk about whatever they're doing, but they were doing it all. I think they may have been 2,000 people. I don't know, not too many. They had the only working temple in Utah, so you know what it is to staff a temple today. And then, in addition to all the temple work that was being done in the recording and the building of wards and the building of the community, they had tremendous problems with water. The Virgin River would go from being nothing to being flooding, and they had to build their own lands and homes and crops, and that was a challenge. So it was a very challenging time when you consider how many directions they were going as a small, successful little community in an extremely arid desert. That life was challenging, but they made it happy, and they counted their blessings and didn't dwell on their troubles so much.
We were connected to southern Utah for 4 generations. It wasn't just St. George, it was Parowan and Tokerville, and I mean all of my ancestors who were called there by Brigham Young to go scratch a living out of the desert, and they learned to love the desert. And I think a lot of my love of St. George was just hearing my parents talk about it, and their love of it, and of southern Utah and as a whole.
Ellis McAllister's parents, Martin Lindsay McAllister and Clara Ann Savage, married in the St. George LDS Temple on September 8, 1895. Clara was a school teacher and Martin was a farmer, teacher, and carpenter. Their families had been friends for years, and Martin's father, John D.T. McAllister, performed their marriage. Clara and Martin settled in St. George as their family. The following December, their first child, Anna, was born 2 months premature. She seemed healthy at first, but unexpectedly passed away only 8 days later. Her parents were heartbroken. Their second daughter, Mary, thrived all through her first year of life, but then got very sick in the summer of 1899. Martin had accepted a mission call from the LDS Church earlier that year to serve in the eastern states. He delayed leaving for several months to care for baby Mary and his wife. Sadly, Mary passed away in September 1899, when she was 19 months old. Martin and Clara were devastated. Martin carried his grief with him, boarding a train for his mission just 4 days after Mary's death. Clara was expecting their third child at the time, and her parents cared for them at their home in Tokerville, Utah, while Martin was away. Clara's pain was deep and lasting. The hardship of several miscarriages, the loss of 2 beautiful daughters, and the subsequent separation from her husband for 2 years took a significant mental and emotional toll on her.
Karma McGregor's parents, Donald Alpine McGregor and Alma Gertrude Watson, got married in the St. George LDS Temple on November 21st, 1895. They lived about 70 miles away in Parowan, Utah. Donald and Alma started their young family, and in 1899, Donald left to attend medical school at Baltimore Medical College. He later transferred to Barnes Medical, and his family joined him in St. Louis, Missouri, until 1902, when he graduated and returned to Parowan, Utah, to start his medical practice. 4 years later, they moved north to Beaver, Utah, where Dr. McGregor took over an existing practice and established the first hospital in the area. The McGregors became well known and loved in their community, and often entertained guests. Dr. McGregor's medical expertise was called on for people and animals all over Beaver County.
Mother's mother had a lot of medical knowledge. She'd pretty much gone to medical school with her husband. I mean, he would come home and study and she'd help him, and she helped him all through taking care of patients because he was the only doctor in the county, and so if he was out taking care of somebody, they'd come to her and she'd take care of them. I mean, she was amazing. I mean, she even helped with surgery, and she did a tracheotomy on a kid once and it worked. She had a lot of knowledge.
Well, grandmother stitched up Aunt Gertrude, who ripped her side open over barbed wire fence when they were up in Pine Valley. And there's no place to go. They're an hour or so away on today's way.
In 1907, Mary Whitehurst joined the LDS Church in England at age 16. Her family disowned her, and she immigrated to Beaver, Utah to start a new life. The McGregors provided Mary a home in exchange for help with housework and child care. The children called her Aunt Mary, and she became a cherished and close part of the family for the rest of her life.
While Martin and Clara McAllister established their family, Clara struggled with health conditions that baffled physicians, since not much was known about mental illness at the time. In 1907, she spent 7 months in the hospital for her mental health. Martin cared for their 3 children under 7 while she was away. Martin struggled to make ends meet, and later that same year, he took a job as a ranger in Dixie National Forest. While this job provided financially for the family, it also required Martin to travel for long stretches of time. For the next several years, Martin was only home to help for a few days each month. His companionship was missed in many ways, as Clara raised their young family and battled mental illness. During this time, Ellis Savage McAllister was born on May 9, 1909, to his loving parents, Martin and Clara McAllister. He was their 6th child, the 4th still living.
About Mom and Dad's name, I don't know the significance of Ellis, but I do know for a man his age, it was a name that we saw several times. There was an Ellis Rasmussen who was a friend of his. There were other Ellises in the yearbook, as I recall, at BYU. There was an Ellis with him in Kiwanis. And so it wasn't a unique name. It was unusual in some respects, but there were other men in his generation named Ellis. Of course, Savage is because of his mother.
Both Donald and Alma McGregor performed in community plays. They loved good music, literature, and poetry. Fine arts were an everyday part of family life. The McGregors were committed to the importance of a good education. They welcomed young family members to live with them at various times while attending nearby Murdoch Academy. In the early 1900s, Donald and several prominent men in Beaver were converted to polygamy by a psychology professor at Murdoch Academy. Donald married Alma's younger sister, Bertha Watson, in July 1909 in Salt Lake City. The Beaver community did not approve of Dr. McGregor's plural marriage. His choice to embrace polygamy also changed his standing with the LDS Church. Despite this, he continued to attend church regularly throughout his life. Alma later reflected that Donald's choice to enter polygamy was very difficult for her, and she never felt right about it. His choice changed all of their lives moving forward. About a year later, Connor McGregor was born to Donald and Alma on July 20th, 1910. She was their 6th child.
Mom was named Karma because grandfather, her father, Donald Alpine, knew a woman named Karma, and he liked that name, but they spelled it with a K, which is highly unusual because it's that Eastern Buddhist way. And karma, as you know, means sort of that law of what goes around comes around. So it can either be doing good to others and good comes back to you, or it can be the opposite. And I thought, that's a perfect name for Mother, because she was always doing good to others. And so when people look at my name and they go, oh, this is unusual, karma. And I say, yeah, it's the good karma. You know. Mother's father named all the women in the family. So Wanda, Roberta, Gertrude, Karma, Mary, and grandmother named, Alpine, Lorenzo. And you can see that. See, Lorenzo was her father's name. So that's how they got their names.
Ellis McAllister was described as a happy little boy who always smiled. Throughout his childhood, his mother's physical and mental health challenges were always present and affected the whole family. Though she received the best medical interventions available at the time, some of Clara's treatments likely added to her chronic health issues. As Ellis's mother struggled, her family was steadfast. Ellis's sisters were daily caregivers and incredible support. Callie was 9 years older than Ellis, and Lila was 7 years older. Ellis and Callie had an especially close bond. Callie was remembered to say that Ellis's softness would win a world. Ellis often spent time with his cousins too. His Aunt Grace Sullivan lived 2 blocks away, and his Uncle Riley Savage lived in a nearby town.
I actually want to talk about the home that he grew up in. They grew up in this little white house that John D.T. McAllister had built for one of his wives. Years later, the house was given to my grandpa Martin McAllister and Clara, his wife. And the children were born, and I don't know if they were born in the house or not. That was the greatest little house. And we would go down in the summertime to visit. What I remember was how cool the house was. You'd walk in from the outside, and it was just so hot.
The house was made out of stucco brick, and that's why it was cool.
And it had very high ceilings. It had a formal parlor. And so, as children, they didn't really stay in the parlor much. But Dad loved that area, and in the front of the house, there was a very large grandfather clock, and it had like a coat rack connected to it and benches connected to it. We always walked in the back door, and it was cool and those high ceilings. And I remember on the right was Grandpa's bedroom, and there was a big brass bed. And then there was the parlor, and then from the parlor it opened onto another bedroom, but then the bedroom opened back onto the kitchen. And so everything was like in a circle. It was just a very cool way that the floor plan was. We'd go up in the attic and play around, and it was hot and dusty and fun, and it was just, I found out later that my father Ellis and his brother John actually slept there when they were growing up. And that makes sense because that would have given them enough bedrooms. The farm was, I would say, to the east of the house, and is now a baseball field for Dixie College. Okay, so fast forward to Aunt Gertrude's funeral. And on the way back I thought, I'm just going to see if I can find Grandpa's house on my own and go look at it. Well, it looked wonderful, and there was a guy out in the side yard building a gazebo. And so I went up and said, I'm the granddaughter of the man who used to live here and gave the history and so forth. It turns out that he was an architect. And I said, oh, I cannot tell you how much this means to me.
Donald McGregor felt increasing pressure about his family's situation. When Karma was just a few months old, he provided financially for Alma and their 6 children, and then left to set up a homestead for Bertha in Mexico. Things didn't go as planned, and Donald and Bertha returned to Utah a year later. Karma's father purchased his first automobile, an EMF, in 1912. Driving was a huge help for Dr. McGregor in reaching patients all over the county. Karma's mother, Alma, was the first woman in southern Utah to drive a car. Family pressures continued to mount, and Donald was anxious for them all to move. He found an appealing living arrangement about 100 miles southwest. The family moved to St. George, Utah in April 1913, when Karma was almost 3 years old. Alma raised 8 children, including Karma, in a large home they built near the center of St. George. Bertha and her oldest son lived in a smaller home built on the lot next door. Karma grew up with the complexities of polygamous family life. Donald established the Washington County Hospital in 1913. A few years later, the community renamed it McGregor Hospital in his honor. It started as a 2-bed facility, but over the next 2 decades grew to 45 rooms and 11 staff. Mary Whitehurst lived in an apartment provided for her at the hospital and served as its head nurse for over 30 years. She set up an extra bed in her room where Karma sometimes spent the night.
The thing that was fun about St. George is it was small. It was a tiny town, probably about the size of a small high school. I don't know, maybe 2,000 at the most. And so everybody was either related to everybody or they knew everyone. And I don't think I had a sense of that until I was much, much older, that all of these people grew up intimately connected, loving each other and knowing their stories and so forth. And so my grandmother, Alma Gertrude, loved my father, adored my father. And I thought, Mother had made a good match and Grandma was happy. What it really was I think Graham had admired him from the time he was little. Everybody knew each other's history and, the good, the bad, the ugly.
And their families were both involved in the city and things. The McAllisters were involved so much in the temple with JDT working there as a temple president, and then Martin was involved in the city also as JDT had been as fireman and getting the city together. Dad's family were involved that way, and Mother's had the only doctor in the area. He was a surgeon and I think he'd been in St. Louis to get his training. And he was the only surgeon in the area and doctor, and he owned the hospital. He bought a home, and then he owned the hospital for years. And he would travel in the horse and buggy. Sometimes Grandmother went with him to the outlying cities to take care of people and do what they needed. So they were very involved in that way. So the families were busy.
Ellis and Karma both started first grade at the Woodward School in St. George in 1915. Ellis was a year older than most children in his grade. Karma came home excitedly to tell her mother, "Mama, there's a boy at school with hair just as curly as mine, and his name even starts with Mac, like mine." Towards the end of their second grade year, the U.S. joined World War I.
So my parents were in the same class from first grade on. They knew each other their whole lives.
Dad was a year older than Mother, and she always said he was an older brother to her.
I mean, she lived so close to her elementary school that she would wait till the first bell rang and run to school and make up before the second bell rang. And then she would come home at noon and do the same thing. They would line up in front of the school before school started, and then the whole school, they would, I don't know this, but I think they'd do the Pledge of Allegiance outside, and then they'd all walk into the school together at the beginning of each school day. And so she would wait and run to school, and she always ended up, she called it the odd squad. The people who were always late were the people who would walk in the school last, and she was always in the odd squad because she was always late.
Ellis's mother, Clara, continued to suffer from poor mental and emotional health, poor nutrition, and poor sleep. Her actions reflected the chronic delusions and disorientation she was experiencing. Clara's primary doctor for many years was Karma's father, Dr. Donald McGregor. Martin was increasingly concerned for Clara's well-being and the whole family's safety. After consulting Dr. McGregor and other medical providers, Martin made the difficult decision that long-term hospitalization was the best course of action for Clara. She was admitted to the Utah State Mental Hospital in Provo, Utah, in August 1918, 3 months before World War I ended. Ellis was 9 years old at the time.
If she lived now, she would have just been medicated and sent home. But back then they didn't know what to do for her.